Welcome to Emerging Technology Horizons. I'm Mark Lewis, the Executive Director of the National Defense Industrial Association's Emerging Technologies Institute. And with me on today's episode is the Honorable Michael Kratsios. Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining us. You've had an amazing career so far. You are currently the Managing Director at ScaleAI, where you lead all of corporate strategy. You assumed that position coming directly from the White House, where you were the fourth Chief Technology Officer of the United States, working with the Office of Science Technology Policy. Michael was also the Acting Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, which essentially supervised all of science and technology in the Department of Defense. That includes oversight of the Missile Defense Agency, DARPA, the Space Development Agency, the Defense Innovation Unit, as well as all the science technology prototype efforts, overseeing the lab activities, the FFRDCs, the whole 9 yards. So I should say it was my privilege to actually work with Michael in both of those roles. When you were in the White House CTO, I was running an organization that did some deep dive support, and we worked on a daily basis. And then I left you. I went to the Pentagon. You followed, and we were working together again on an absolute daily basis. So that was absolutely phenomenal experience. I would tell you that under Michael's leadership, the White House truly reoriented U.S. national technology policy. Identified some key, explicit, primary focus areas that really made sure that America continued to lead in a list of emerging technologies, which I think will be familiar to any of the listeners or viewers of this podcast. You had a special emphasis on artificial intelligence, but across the board, everything from reinvigorating supersonic flight, one of my personal favorite topics. Hypersonics was the key area, but also looking across the industrial base. And you brought that same skill set to the Pentagon as well. And so Michael, again, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate your time today.
No, thank you, Mark. It's tremendous to catch up with you and be here with you today.
So I want to, I guess if I can, I kind of want to start off. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing at ScaleAI? What your role is as a managing director involves?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you may know, ScaleAI is essentially an enterprise AI company. What we try to do, and our core mission, is to help accelerate AI applications across industries. So the idea is, how can you create tooling and other services to sort of help the pace at which artificial intelligence is deployed across a wide variety of industries? And really, sort of our core thesis and sort of insight into the world is that most people sort of actually treat data as an afterthought. And in the world of AI, that's a huge problem, because if you have bad data, you have bad AI. So what we try to do is sort of accelerate this development of AI by saying, data in itself is actually the new code. We provide the data and the tools that are really necessary to deploy AI as easily as one would potentially deploy code. So we provide a lot of different sort of infrastructure tools to help developers and others, and try to solve very hard AI-related problems for very large enterprises as well. Amazing company. I'm excited to be here. We just raised our latest round a couple months ago at about a $7 billion valuation, and so it's been a fun ride. We work with great customers, including the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Army, and even in the commercial sector, folks like PayPal and iRobot, Square. So it's been a lot of fun.
Interesting. You must have a lot of good stories about the difference between working with a government sponsor and working with the PayPals of the world.
It is. Yeah. I always tend to feel like when you usually work with a government customer, they're always 2 or 3 years behind where commercial customers are, and a lot of what it takes to make a difference when working with the government is a lot around education. It's showing them what and how sort of best in class in the private sector are operating, what they're working on, how they execute on projects, and show them that it too is possible in the federal government if you put your mind to it and kind of align resources correctly.
I know you and I had previously, when we were in the Pentagon together, we would kind of lament the fact that many of the developments in AI were started from federal investments, and yet now we were in the position of the government trying to bring in those commercial capabilities that the government had somehow had a hand in starting in the first place.
No, it's so true. You tend to see over history, as you see some sort of tremendous basic early stage sort of research development that comes out of that comes out of the government in some form or fashion, and the real accelerant oftentimes to sort of full scale deployment happens in the private sector. And the question is like, how can you bring that back at a pace and at a quality level that kind of meets what you need in sort of Pentagon related problems?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I always admired about, the two key roles that you filled in government was you brought that industry perspective. I thought it was a very unique perspective. And it kind of the fresh set of eyes with which you viewed the government was actually very effective in getting a start on solving some of the problems that we were tackling.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think the truth is there are other, the most of the problems that the government is trying to solve are not particularly unique. There are other people in the world who have solved them in slightly different contexts already. And the question is just, how do you take those learnings and actually apply them to what often is a much more complicated bureaucracy? And if you can find a way to kind of wade through that mess and figure out how to do something right, you can make a really, really big difference.
Yeah, so that's a really great lead into, one of the first questions I wanted to ask you is given your experience, given your knowledge, how do you think the government can actually accelerate the adoption of artificial intelligence and truly leverage the capabilities, all that AI could do for the government, and especially the Department of Defense?
Yeah, I think there's lots of ways to do it. I think the most important, and I think oftentimes I guess the first way to think about it is, don't believe that by simply assigning an AI lead at an agency is going to somehow solve all of your AI problems. And bracketing the issues in government for a second, this is actually perennial problem in the private sector as well. For many sort of traditional legacy businesses out there, their solution to trying to get AI brought into their business practices is by hiring, some sort of AI skunkworks lead that has sort of two people who report to him, and then they go out and try to figure out what are cool, innovative AI ways to integrate into these companies. And if you think about these sort of multi-billion-dollar companies that have tons of business lines spread all across the world, having a couple of guys brainstorming on pilot projects on AI, that's not going to change the direction of the particular company. Or if it does, it's going to be at a very slow pace. And I think that lesson should be applied in the federal government. Yes, there probably should be someone who's designated as an AI person that can report up the chain through political leadership. But what you have to in order to have larger scale applications, you have to understand that it's a whole of agency approach to trying to incorporate this into processes. And I think the example that we're seeing at DoD with kind of the early growing struggles of the Jake is a great example of why you need to be really thoughtful about this. Simply sort of assigning an organization that's the place to do AI doesn't necessarily mean that all the other services and all the other COCOMs and everyone else is going to suddenly start using them as a resource for AI. So to me, I think kind of the most important accelerator of this is thinking very carefully around how you can sort of diffuse the applications across all the actual end users rather than just assigning one person to be the AI guy.
No, that absolutely makes sense. I don't know if you would agree, but one of the things that I witnessed was there was frankly a certain lack of understanding of what AI actually was and what it could do in the Pentagon. Frankly, at times there were some cases where it seemed to be buzzwordy. All right, we're going to sprinkle some AI into this project now. My joke was you go to the AI store, buy a little bit of AI, open your can of AI, sprinkle it on whatever you're doing, and you've solved your problem. And yeah.
No, I think you're totally right, and I think it's an issue that I guess it's sort of perennial across Washington. They love to chase buzzwords, whether it's big data or whether it's AI or whatever it is that's coming around the turn. I think people just sort of gravitate to it. I think to me, and something that I think about in my current role, and I did in my past roles as well, I think one of the most important things that needs to be done is sort of back to what you were saying, better education across the end users around what this technology actually is and how you get to a place where where AI can actually make a difference. And I think oftentimes you don't just go to the store and buy one unit of AI and like plug it into your system. It's a much larger and harder process and project. And to me, I think what we talk about a lot and what I think is really important to share is how critical the underlying data is to the actual AI solution. So you could recognize that, that there is some there could be a great algorithm be used to do sort of like change detection based on sort of SAR imagery that you have. Now, the question is that the quality of that output is only as good as the underlying data that has trained it. So as an end user, I think, most folks they just want to see that front end that shows them the change detection and shows them like where to go look or whatever. But at its core, in order to have that succeed, you have to build this ever-changing and ever-updated cycle of data that sort of flows through the system. And I think that multi-step process of actually implementing these algorithms with a back end of AI labeling and training that happens in perpetuity, I think is important to share, because it's not buying a conventional procurement of a single item, and then you never have to update it again. It's a constantly updating, sort of living, breathing model.
Right. Of course, from a defense standpoint, that also can introduce a vulnerability. If you're the adversary, you might look to corrupt data. That's not necessarily a problem that the commercial sector would have, or is it? Is it?
It is. I think in the DoD context, I think you're probably more at risk of that. So I think that really goes back to the critical importance of constantly sort of updating, refining, and teaching your model. Right. Because if your model is stagnant and you're not sort of labeling new data and training it with the new data based on the new circumstances, you could get in a position where the adversary could very quickly understand what the weaknesses are of that particular model. And I think that's something that we talk about a lot at Scale, and why it's so critical for whatever industry that you're in to constantly be refreshing the data. And the questions that you as a leader at the Pentagon are trying to answer today are definitely going to be different than types of questions you're going to be answering in 6 months from now or a year from now. So you must create a pipeline or a system or a process that allows you to be able to have these models be a lot more robust over time.
Right. And that's not something the Pentagon is always very good at, is it?
It is not. I think the Pentagon is really good at buying sort of single items or single things, and this idea of needing sort of constant maintenance sometimes is not something that is familiar in the world of software.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that kind of leads into another aspect of this which is that we are in a race with some peer competitors. And, especially with China, they are investing very heavily in AI. They've made no secret of that. They've declared that they want to be the world leader in AI. Can you reflect on the competition or the race between the U.S. and China? Where do you think we stand, and what should we be concerned about?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we worked on this even together a few years ago. I think one of the most important things for me to assess before you can even start sort of making these conclusions is to actually be able to get to a ground truth, or as close to ground truth that you can, on what actually is happening in China. What is the CCP actually doing? And the CCP has a knack for being able or very effectively continually putting out press releases about big dollars being spent, big dollars being investment, big breakthroughs happening. And the question is, how true is that? How true is that? And I think we as sort of as Americans and as a think tank community needs to kind of dig into that and be able to say, when the Chinese say they're going to spend $10 billion in AI in this province over the next year, like, did they actually deploy that capital? Was that actually used for research? Did it actually go into an investment? And I think some great research was done by Stippy, by also CSET at Georgetown, who has kind of poked at this issue. But I think we need to do a lot more to essentially be able to empower our policymakers to be able to actually know what we're competing against. Because if you're competing against whatever headline is running in the latest tech blog, you're probably not going to be making a good policy conclusion. Now, all that being said, I think I still believe that the U.S. is a leader in artificial intelligence. I think there are areas or subdomains within it where the Chinese have stepped up, and I think the most obvious one is probably around computer vision. It's a place where they've invested quite a bit based just on their facial recognition technology, CCTV, and all sorts of other stuff. But broadly speaking, in the world of AI, we still have the best universities. We have the best students graduating from universities. We have the best startups. We have the most well-funded startups. So there's a number of axes you could kind of look at, and I think we continue to lead. The question is sort of what is the velocity of sort of China's investment and improvement? And I think that's where the questions come up, because they're trying very, very hard to push ahead very, very quickly. And it's incumbent on us to kind of make sure that we are playing to the strengths of our system. And that was kind of a lot of what kind of we thought about in the years past. But I think to me, one of the most important dynamics is around this question is really this question of China's track record on human rights, and more importantly, the values that underpin the technology that they develop. The CCP is using artificial intelligence to track ethnic minorities, to create social credit scores, to censor the internet, to suppress free speech, and those are all actions or use cases of AI which are sort of very much in violent opposition to what the West, what the United States, what our Western allies believe in. So for us, it's incumbent that we kind of drive and maintain our leadership position because we want to make sure that the next great AI technologies are underpinned by our values.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, I couldn't agree with you more. And I know you and I both spent a lot of time on the issue of AI ethics and making sure that we had an ethical grounding for all the work that we were doing in this area. And yeah, one of the things that keeps me up at night when I think about Chinese investments in AI is the potential to misuse the technology, which they've already demonstrated, frankly.
Yep.
So
Yep.
Agree with you. So that kind of leads into obviously AI is, critical capability, critical technology. There are other emerging technologies. We had our list of 11 different technologies, and you had a leadership role, maybe the leadership role in setting that technology agenda in the White House for a number of years, and then in the Pentagon. I mean, if you could kind of comment on the progress that we've made. How do you think we're doing in advancing these emerging technologies? What have we accomplished so far, and what do we need to keep doing to make sure we're ahead of the competition?
Absolutely. I think we have, and I think there's this general sort of recognition now in Washington, more so than you probably had 4 or 5 years ago, around the importance of driving through sort of organized, more structured government programs, the way that you can sort of drive these leadership positions in important emerging technologies. And from a congressional, action, the National Quantum Initiative Act was passed, which essentially sort of created a national program on quantum leadership. Our American AI Initiative was sort of codified into law as the National AI Initiative Act, and kind of that was signed became law at the tail end of 2020. And we see a lot of work with a lot of our 5G efforts were again taken up by Congress and pushed through. We see a lot of action, as you see on semiconductors. Chips legislation could a little bit slower than the others, but that continues. Right. We'll see how that pans out. But in any case, you see bipartisan consensus on the need to do something in that area. So on the positive side, I think we have seen this has become in an environment or a time when Washington is extraordinarily polarized. There is this core center of emerging technologies, which in a bipartisan fashion, everyone realizes we have to do something about it. And I think, to me, what I'm seeing is there's this general coalescing around a number of sort of axes or foundational pillars, if you will, of how these strategies generally develop. And I think that's good progress. I think, on the first front, it's what do you do around research and development? How can you ensure that all the money that we spend as a federal government is better coordinated in a way that we're not doing duplicative work, that we're sort of organized towards a more structured R&D plan? And we've seen that with AI and quantum and even some of our 5G spending. And I think it's done, we're not being overly prescriptive, but at least we're sort of like moving the ship in a more consistent direction as a federal government. I think the second piece, which I think you just mentioned, is around sort of these regulations and policies. We need to make sure that we are sort of removing the barriers to innovation in these particular emerging technologies, whether that's allowing supersonic jets to fly, whether it's, making sure that AI-powered medical diagnostics and other types of technologies are sort of approved in a safe and expeditious manner, whether autonomous vehicles can be driving, whether drones can be flying. These are all areas where policy changes can actually push innovation forward. And I think we've seen sort of, again, a bipartisan consensus on being able to sort of get these technologies kind of out there from a regulatory standpoint. I think the third area, which continues to be something that a lot of folks watch and think about and are making progress on, is on the workforce front. In the sense of we need to be educating more Americans in these critical fields in order to be the ones who will make the next great discoveries and next great technologies in the years ahead. And it's very hard to do, and it's a long cycle, but we have to get more Americans trained and moving, and I think we're making progress there. And kind of the last axis, which I think you see actually a lot of emphasis in the most recent Biden administration, is this question of international engagement. I think it goes back a little bit to what we were talking about with AI in China. It's how do we partner with our allies to provide sort of a unified front to breakthroughs in all these emerging tech areas, whether it's partnering with our allies on 5G related activities and making sure that we're sort of blocking out nefarious actors like Huawei, whether it's with being able to do AI or other emerging tech related research projects across borders, whether it's setting sort of standards with our allies. I mean, there's lots of ways that sort of creating that unified front can be very helpful against CCP.
Yeah, we've actually, so here at ETI, we've spoken a lot about the importance of friends, partners, and allies. I couldn't agree with you more. I remind people that the United States still is spending the largest amount of S&T in the world, but China is moving up really quickly. And that sounds bad, but if you add in all of our allies, if you look at the next 6 countries down the list, they are all our closest allies. You add them to our expenditures, it completely swamps what the Chinese are spending. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. I would say one of the more encouraging developments I've seen over the years is universities that are really stepping up to the plate and becoming more and more engaged in support of national defense. Places like Texas A&M, their George Bush Center, Arizona State. Michael Crow has been a leader in thinking about how a university can align with defense priorities. Mitch Daniels at Purdue, I mean, he's declared defense S&T as one of their top priorities, and so they're welcoming of work with the department, with the government. I think has been I think one of the really positive developments that I think we actually.
I totally agree. I think there's been a big shift in the last few years about trying to we've seen more academic institutions much more open to talking about their interest in helping in national security, and I think that could not be better for the country. I think we could always do more, and there's lots of others who could push the accelerator down, but it's exciting to see. And I've worked a little bit with some of the Purdue folks as well, and just being able to kind of watch the excitement that they bring to it, and even just having university leadership sort of acknowledge that it's important and acknowledge how important it is for our country and our long-term security. It can go a very, very long way in kind of in making people kind of think about working on things that they maybe didn't imagine they ever would.
Absolutely. Michael, our time is coming to the end. This is another one where I think we could talk all day about a whole range of subjects, which means it gives me an excuse to ask you back on the podcast at some point. But thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed catching up, and thanks for everything you've done for the country. I mean, you took a chunk of your life, dedicated it to the government. It was great having you in the government. I'm delightful to see you applying those skills now back in industry. And thanks for everything that you've done.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a ton of fun. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks a lot.